Hello, and welcome to Sundays with Vernā podcast. This podcast was created in the wake of Black Lives Matter movement to bring together the brightest minds in culture and science and business and politics to have candid conversations that bridge our divides and amplify awareness. I'm your host, Vernā Myers, and I am so glad that you've joined us. And today we have a wonderful show for you. I am happy to introduce Anu Gupta. Let me tell you a little bit about Anu before we get started. Anu Gupta is an educator and lawyer, a scientist, and the founder and CEO of Be More with Anu, and an educational technology benefit corporation that trains professionals across corporate, nonprofit, and government sectors to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging and wellness by breaking bias. His work has reached over 300 organizations, training more than 80,000 professionals, impacting over 30 million lives. As a gay immigrant of color, he came to the work of breaking bias after almost ending his life due to lifelong experiences with racism and homophobia and Islamophobia. In his new book, Breaking Bias, he blends ancient Buddhist wisdom with modern scientific evidence to take the reader on a deep time journey to explore human identities and identity-based biases, and to recognize that breaking bias is the key to unlocking multiple crises in the world, from racism to sexism, from classism and all the other isms, to burnout, loneliness, and climate change. His innovative, interactive approach invites us to put these tools to use right from the start, and potentially transforms the way we think and the way we live. Welcome, Anu.
It is such an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Vernā.
Oh my goodness, I could not wait for this conversation. First of all, I thought to myself, wait, we're kind of the same people, but we're absolutely not. You know how that is, right?
Exactly.
Where you are so connected to the spirit of a person and their experience. I mean, you went to NYU, you got the Ruth Tilden Scholarship. I was offered that scholarship, but decided that I didn't know what I was doing. So then I didn't go to NYU. But you're from India. India is like one of my favorite countries in the whole world. Obviously, I talk a lot about breaking through bias. You do too. Meditation, so much of the Buddhist philosophy has influenced me so greatly. And I'm just like, Anu and I, we're the same. We're both lawyers, but of course we're not. And there is so much to explore, both in the overlap as well as maybe places where our lives are quite different. And, when I was reading your bio, I was struck by your story and how open and honest you are about your struggles, and your struggle in particular with mental health and thinking of taking your own life. And I know that a lot of people don't start off this way, these kind of conversations, but I wanted to acknowledge your life and to tell you how grateful I am that you're still here with us to share so much of your journey. And so bless you. And I also realized that it's Mental Health Month as well as AAPI Heritage Month, etc. And so if you don't mind, I just wanted to know, how did you move from deep despair to this incredible, creative, generative spirit that you're bringing to the world now through Be More and many of your other activities, if you don't mind?
Yes, of course, I wouldn't mind. This is why I'm here. And thank you for these beautiful questions. Like you said, we have so much in common, right? And it's the differences that really make us shine across these journeys. And I think for me, I immigrated to the US when I was 10 years old. I was a young child, had grown up in India in a quite diverse setting. And, in India, they have all sorts of hierarchies and challenges, but coming to the US was quite new and novel for me. And for me, from very early on, the coded message was that I have to study and do well, because as an immigrant, like, I just have to conform and assimilate. And that's what I did. I changed my name to Andy, and, basically learned the accent and performed all the things, and really excelled academically. Um, but I did that by just staying quiet, kind of like basically I internalized the model minority myth for myself.
Mm.
And as a result of that, anytime I felt excluded, like right after 9/11, I grew up in New York City. If someone would scream Osama bin Laden to me, or "You terrorists, get out of here," I would just ignore those comments and just suppress them within. Or if I'd be bullied for being gay, I would be like, okay, just don't engage, right? It was always flight mode for me. And after college, in college, I realized I wanted to do international human rights. I wanted to live abroad, work abroad. And after college, that's what I did. I worked in Myanmar on issues of human rights and ethnic reconciliation, and taught in South Korea. And I just loved that time abroad, because it gave me a respite from the daily microaggressions and ways of otherness that I felt. And after that, I went to Cambridge to get my master's in international development and really understand the social sciences of human development. But going back to law school was a pressure cooker environment. Even though NYU is a wonderful school and it's amazing for people that are in the public interest and not in corporate law and all the things, um, bias is something we didn't talk about. And anytime I mentioned the existence of bias in crim law and civil procedure, I would just be met with blank stares. And
Testified to this. You know that. I
yes,
know that same thing where you're just like, am I the one who's not well here? Or is
yeah,
this whole institute ignoring something that is so obvious in order to keep in place these institutions and the power? And
yeah,
it's just, yeah. So you do, even when you go to a fabulous school like NYU and you're a root tilting scholar, you
yeah.
still had to deal with that. Yeah.
And it's just like, I think people just didn't have the tools to talk about pain, right? Ultimately, bias is painful, it's emotional. And for me, be going through that first year was just a pressure cooker. I just felt so much anxiety, so much depression, and all of the self-loathing that I had just bottled inside just came up and running. And that's where I felt like I just needed to get out of here. I just needed to get out of this earth. And I lived on the 18th floor of a tall apartment building in Manhattan, and basically opened the window, was about to jump off, but instead of falling forward, I fell backwards into my apartment, standing on the ledge. And for me, that's the moment of grace. I have no explanation, because there's no reason I shouldn't have fallen forward. And then in that moment, I just got up and I was like, I need to call someone. I think I almost died. And I called this person, a queer Asian American woman who I just met actually the previous week during orientation, who lived quite far away from where I was, but she happened to be walking on my block that moment. She showed up in my apartment in less than 5 minutes. We spoke for, I don't know, 5, 6 hours. I don't know how long that night was. And the next morning, I was at NYU Counseling Services. And that's when I knew the gravity of what had just happened. And I began my own breaking bias journey. And for me, that journey was really about finding any and all tools possible to help me overcome the self loathing and the self hatred that I had felt for myself because of my ethnicity, my race, my religious background, my sexual orientation, my gender identity, all the things, my class background, my disabilities, my neurodiversities, you name it. Um, and with that said, my passion for human rights was still what took me to law school. But in law school, I started seeing that while I cared a lot about international human rights, there was so much more work to do domestically, right? I would go into prisons to do like legal research trainings for inmates. And I would notice that everybody was just either black or brown and came from really impoverished backgrounds. And I remember going to Bedford Hills, which is a women's prison upstate in New York. I was wearing something called Liberty on my body that was stripped off while I was visiting the prison. So I couldn't imagine what it's like to be a human being living in those cages. And that's where I began to see like the big picture of racial disparities in our country, whether it's criminal justice or healthcare or education, you name it, the statistics, have been the same since the 1960s. Maybe there were some changes a little bit here and there. And that's what really piqued my interest. Um, And that, after law school, I worked on issues of racial equity and gender equity, trying to understand what are the root causes of these problems. And I understood that we could change and make all the cosmetic changes that are needed to policies, all we want. But unless we shift perception, unless we shift hearts and minds, we're not going to make any movement, because every one of the policies are being executed by human beings like you and I. And if they have conscious and unconscious biases, that's going to inform their decision making. And that's how, at the micro level, those are the decisions that aggregate into racial, gender, and all forms of other disparities. So for me, I think my work was cut out for me. Like, I think it found me. And ever since I started that work, I didn't share my personal story as much because I always wanted to put others up front. I wanted to talk about the Black folks I was, advocating for, the trans folks, the Indigenous folks. But once I shared my story, particularly in my TED Talk, you wouldn't understand how many people reached out to me, Vernā. How, like,
That's what I was going to say.
hundreds and
Yeah.
hundreds. Like, when I give talks, people come up to me too, me too. And that's when I was like, oh, wow, this is how marginalized people have been coping. And just as other people gave me a voice to share my story, I'm giving them a voice to share theirs. So that's kind of the full circle moment. And for me, the work of breaking bias is really transforming these stereotypes. Dr. King has a quote that really holds the container for my work, which is, our goal is to build a beloved community. This will require qualitative changes in our souls and quantitative changes in our lives. And for me, breaking bias is making those qualitative and quantitative changes.
I am so grateful that I have come to be in your orbit. I have to say thank you also for naming the pain, because when people don't say what it is, folks who are having it think there's something wrong with them, which
Yeah.
makes it even more difficult. So thank you for naming that and sharing your own experience. And I'm sure you get lots and lots of people who are saying me too. And that is really kind of the beginning, I think, as you mentioned. And it's so wild that you talked about the beloved community, because I just wrote an entire blog post on it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
We were
I
on the same
mean, as
vibe.
in, I
Same
know,
vibe.
as in like last week right? And I was also just thinking about the imaginative world that the beloved community, and how joyful it could be to get to that place where everyone has dignity and is given opportunity and safety and
Yeah.
freedom, and our conflicts are resolved in a way that allows us to keep growing and blossoming as a human family. Okay, we don't want to. So because there are all these other like really specific questions that I have for you, but I just want to say again, thank you. And again, for the folks who are out there, listen to what Anu is saying, because this is the way we find our way back, and that we can actually help each other. So you started Be More. So tell me how, and I'm from Baltimore, we call it Be More too.
I know. No
It's a
E.
different thing, right? But tell me how that all transpired, and then tell me about this scientific approach and how you're moving people's behavior and their awareness, their hearts and their minds.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, for me, there were two things that I was looking at when I was working as an attorney at Vera Institute. So they were basically a think tank, think and do tank, as they would call themselves. And what I was really curious was, what are the root causes of racial disparities across the board? The word systemic racism or racism gets thrown around, but I was like, well, how can we like further narrow it down? And I was able to discern that using some of the social science, background that I had in research, and really look at the statistics, the quant data across the board. And we identified four root causes: lack of resources, something as simple as safe green parks, supermarkets, public transportation; presence of trauma, from police presence to toxic waste sites to, landfills; institutional policies that are racially um, enforced, right? From stop and frisk to a whole host of ADHD assessments in schools to bias. So these are the four root causes that we identified. And I was like, well, now that and we're not using the word race at all, but we're using the social science literature to really demonstrate that this is what's causing racial disparities for anyone. Even if you're a white person, right, living in Appalachia or somewhere else, this is what's explaining it: lack of resources, presence of trauma, implicit biases. So for me, it was like, oh, it's the human element of it that really made it wonderful. But this was, Renee, like pre-Black Lives Matter. This was 2012. And I was basically beating my head that we need to be talking about this. Like, there's huge amounts of disparities out there. But I think at that time, the institution wasn't ready to take this on. But very generously, they let me use this research, which was under, they gave me the IP for it so I could use it to further refine it. And then I started talking about this research with my church communities, my meditation communities, doing presentations at medical boards, at academic centers. And community members would come up to me like, "Oh, this is great, but it doesn't help me. What are you going to do about it?" And I was like, "What?" It's like, this, I'm a researcher, I'm a scholar, I talk about these things, I write white papers. Like, no, but I'm suffering. Like, I went to a Native American reservation, the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. And the kind of grinding poverty I saw there reminded me of my time in Myanmar. And that's when I woke up. I was like, I can't just be this like intellectual scholar sitting in ivory towers publishing reports. I need to do something about it. And that's where the idea of breaking bias really came to me. So in those four, root causes, only bias is the one that we as humans can actually act upon, because lack of resources, presence of trauma, and institutional policies are results of, collective action. But bias is we all make decisions. And then if we can begin to shift consciousness, we can actually shift systems. So that's where the idea really came from. And once this was it, I wanted to make sure this work wasn't looked upon as fluff, as you know, right? So I
Yes.
made sure I got, the National Science Foundation to fund us to really build our methodology. And our methodology is really about training professionals, people with decision-making power, like doctors and lawyers and teachers and police officers, therapists, in behavior change, using what the science calls contemplative sciences. So contemplative sciences are basically sciences that are about the mind, about the interiority, i.e. mindfulness-based tools. So
Yes.
that's how we bridge mindfulness-based tools with, all the business cases and sociology and history and legal history of, all forms of isms.
So how does the approach that you're using, the science, the interiority, all of the ways in which you have data, how do you see it shifting inclusivity and equity, which you talk about as and different from equality, but equity in the business world?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I forgot to mention is like Be More is actually an acronym. It's Beyond Equality B, and Movement of Opportunities Rising for Everyone More. And for us, Beyond Equality
Love
is really
that.
what you said: inclusivity, equity, and belonging. So it's kind of moving beyond those realms. And basically what we did was we tried to identify, using the social sciences, what are the skills that humans need to really push equity forward, whether it's doctors with their patients or teachers with their students, or, with HR folks and people just interacting day to day within companies, whether it's tech or finance. And based on the research, we identified 10 competencies. So awareness and comprehension are two of them, but it's things like curiosity, optimism, skillful communication, empathy and compassion, well-being, collective identity, social cohesion, and empowerment. And there's so much social science research behind each one of these competencies. So for us, what the goal is really to train professionals in building these skills, but using content that's about human identities. So that's relevant, not just curiosity for the sake of curiosity, but curiosity in a relational context, across gender,
Yes.
across race, across human intersectionalities. How do we build that? So bridging the information gap and correcting misinformation. You'd be surprised the number of doctors and nurses I've trained in the last 10 years who believe that race is biological.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not kidding
That's
you.
how strong the construct is. That's how
That's
strong the construct is, that you could actually go to medical school
yes.
and somehow not understand that human beings are like 99.9% the same, right? It's
Or that race
how
was
is
made
that?
up. Race was made up in
Yeah, the
1691 in the
color.
state of Virginia, right? With
I
the idea of whiteness,
know.
right? But this is because of miseducation and the information gap, right? So part of me as like a behavioral scientist, I'm like, yes, there are so many inequities, but I'm like, well, all these people that are being trained by our systems, our education system, can I blame them all for not knowing better? Or maybe I can, right? But then I would be where I was before I got on the ledge. And
Yeah.
then exactly. Or I can take a proactive
Yeah.
approach to educate them. So that's basically what we do. And the way we train people in building these 10 competencies is through online trainings, asynchronous trainings, and then complementing that with facilitation. Because we discovered in our research a couple of things. The reason why we discovered a lot of DEI trainings have not moved the needle as much is because a lot of people feel shame in them. And when there's shame in
Exactly.
the room, we can't learn. So what we
Yeah.
and because there's such different starting points around this context, some people have graduate degrees, others are like kindergartners. We have to
Yes.
create psychological safety, which we can do with, virtual content that's self-led, that's short and interactive, and
That's
then
right.
bring in the facilitations so folks have the same understanding of these concepts and then apply it to their workplaces, whether they're doctors or nurses or, working in tech or finance, something else, media.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, so one of the things that I'm thinking about is, thank gosh that you are on the road to going against the anti-woke movement, right? You're just like, I don't even understand that. Like, you don't want to be awake or what? You're against awakeness. I don't get it.
Yeah.
But it's one of those intentional efforts to put people who unintentionally are working in this biased mindset, right? It's trying to like cement that, right? And what you are doing is saying, hey, no, open up, look, pay attention, and you're not bad. Like let's not go into the guilt, shame, attack,
Hmm.
blame thing. Let's just like really feel like there's possibility here for all of
Yeah.
us as human beings. We need this so much. This is so much about what Sundays with Vernā is about and why I
Mhm.
started it, because I also could see that there is so many ways, so much misinformation. It's like Lauren Hill's, like the miseducation, right?
Yes, it is
It's
miseducation.
so deep. Yeah, it's so deep. And I do believe that once people get that information, I don't know what your experience is. Once they get it and then, they get over the fear of it,
Yeah.
they are able to do their jobs better, but they just
Yeah.
feel better.
I'll give you an example and two different people, right? One from a subordinated identity, one from a dominant identity. So, one of my students, super high achiever, Black woman, executive of a large, large company, right? But she was always the one who was the only one, went to like an elite school, like just accomplished everything left and right. But in the back of her head, there was always this voice that I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I don't belong here. Even though, like, she is like super stellar everything, right? And she was also raising her kids that way. She had two
Yes.
little ones, right? But after she went through our programming and started doing some of the practices that we shared with her, education, yes, that's cognitive, but then we bring in the right brain, right, through these practices where we're really shifting the internal environment. It's gone 180. She does not care what others think
Right.
anymore because she knows who she is and she knows the stories that make her feel small. It's not that they don't come up, but when they come up with mindfulness, she is able to transform them. So it's been such a,
Yeah.
I mean, and to this day, she's one of our biggest champions. Like it's just such a joy to be with her. Um, and then similarly, I have someone who's a white person, a white man, who's gone through these programs, who just felt so scared. His word around this was like toxic. This is toxic. But I think what he needed was more compassion, not only for others, but for himself, because he was being so hard on himself.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
And the second he was
And
able
that's
to
when we
let
stay
go,
stuck.
yeah,
Yeah.
he was
Yeah.
like, oh, I can hear other people. I don't have to agree with them, but I don't have to get so worked up around it if I disagree with them. I can actually have a conversation. Workplaces transform because both of them are at the director level, right? So this is where like leadership matters.
Oh, what's so interesting about what you're saying is something I learned really early on in therapy, which is that if you can have a breakthrough, it really does change your past and
Yeah.
your future, right? And so all the yuck that got poured into you sort of like no longer has that effect. And then
Yeah.
you're also changing how you're walking in the world. how you're raising your own children, like what the families like. So it is freedom. It's a type of freedom.
It is freedom.
And yeah, and it's for every group, because there's no group that isn't plagued by misinformation and ignorance and a lack of exposure. And all of us have fear, and all of us are working through that. And all of us are, in many cases, learning to love ourselves, which for me is kind of the beginning. Like if you haven't figured out how to love yourself, it is unlikely that you will be able to love someone else in an unconditional way, not in a way that has all of these conditions to it.
It's like what the most famous drag queen in the world, RuPaul, says: if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you gonna love someone else, right?
Sure. It's so basic, but so true.
So basic.
And people aren't, it's a key to opening, I think, people's hearts. But I want to hear, I'm sure our listeners are like, okay, so what are you doing? Like, what does it look like? Like, give me an example of a practice. Yeah.
So PRISM is perspective taking, pro-social behavior, individuation, stereotype replacement, and mindfulness. And mindfulness is really the bedrock of all the PRISM tools. And what mindfulness purely is the act of noticing, being aware. So when stereotypes arise in the mind, we become aware of them. I'm with Vernā, right? She has blondish highlights and she's wearing clear eyeglasses. What are those associations that come to mind? And I just have to notice them. And what bias is when we notice them and we believe them, and then we make decisions based off of it. So what we're creating here is some space. And once we have that, we move to stereotype replacement, which is really that for a lot of marginalized populations, particularly Black folks, people who are Black, for the vast majority of the world, we have a lot of negative associations drilled into our brains when it comes to the appearance of certain people, whether they're Black or Indigenous or Chinese or whatever ethnicity they're from. So we basically, when we notice those stereotypes in our mind, we actively replace them with positive examples. So I did that with Dr. King or an Ella Baker. And that's where changing the neurotransmitters, the associations in our minds. And then we can move to the fun body and heart-based practices. So individuation is curiosity. When I'm with Vernā, the unique individual she is, the individual she is versus my ideas of her. The lawyer, the executive, the DEI pioneer, all the things, right? Those have associations, but really being with her for who she is. And then moving to pro-social behaviors, which is actually active cultivation of compassion, joy, altruism for oneself and others. And this is really important when it comes to identities like race and gender and sexual orientation, because scientists have studied these phenomenon like the racial empathy gap, right? That's why we see Black patients receive lower doses of pain medication, identical level of, but we can transform it. Our brains are plastic, but we need these practices. So we can do it. We have the tools. We basically train them in these tools in our programs. So alongside the left brain education of bridging the information gap, we're actually leading them through these exercises, through whether it's meditative practices or reflection questions or journaling or somatic exercises. So yeah, we're beginning to kind of shift the inner neurochemistry.
I mean, everything you're saying totally tracks my experience for sure. And this whole idea of space, having a little bit of space, just enough to notice that you just did that thing with that person. You just did this quick, I put them in a box, right? And then if you like the box, you're moving towards them. And if you don't like the box, then not only are you moving away from them, but maybe you're not promoting them, or maybe you're not investing them and cultivating them. Maybe you're not hiring them, right? So there are these specific actions, as you said, that follow this quick association, and breaking down those associations. I don't know how else you do it except for really a practice of meditation, that practice of, well, first and foremost, seeing your own ego, that whole thing where we've identifying as something and then throwing identities onto other people. And then this whole idea of having a moment to notice, oh, I'm doing it, right? And that's the other thing that I talk to people about. It's not like you're not going to do it. You're a human being, and that's how we're processing, right? It's just, are you going to act on it? And do you have enough space to even notice that you're doing that? And one of the things that I learned when I was putting together my TED talk was this whole thing about substituting a stereotype, right? So I'm like showing the pictures of all these different really, really accomplished Black men and children to just be like, okay, what about these folks, right? Because at some point, a friend of mine said, how many examples do we need? Exactly. To convince people to let go of their stereotypes. Stereotypes are very they're sticky, you know?
And they're harmful. There are no good stereotypes because they prevent us from seeing people for who they are. Even if
Say that again.
Stereotypes are harmful because they prevent us from seeing people for who they are. Sometimes people are like, well, you're Asian American, you're Indian. There are all these positive stereotypes. I'm like, no, I'm not an IT person. Because every time I go to a party, everybody assumes I'm an IT person and they want to tell me about their last trip to India. You know, I love my birth country.
They cannot see you.
Exactly. They can't see me. Anu, right? And when I tell them, like, I work in DEI and diversity, they're like, huh? What? Right? Again. And, you know, my example itself is stereotype replacement because what kind of person does DEI? Is there one kind of, it's any kind of human because DEI is for all of humanity, right? Intersectionality of our humanity.
And, you know, the other thing about stereotypes is they can be positive and negative, but both are problematic, right? Because you're making a decision about who someone is without knowing them, right? And it's a quick, fast, and then sometimes people think safe way to move through the world. How do you get people to feel safe anew in order to like probe some of these stereotypes and decide to really take a person in for who they are before labeling them and either dismissing them or, you know, or praising them?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question. And that's what we realized from our research, right? So we basically stated up front before all of our programs that this work is deeply painful and personal. So we've designed an approach that's shame-free and trauma-informed, where we're being vulnerable. Like I lead with my story that these are the impacts, right? And with that said, you know, we're not perfect. We still have ways where we may have overlooked certain things. So feel free to, you know, engage with us where we didn't use the best language. But what we say is that our intention here is for you to feel safe because you belong, right? And you can trust us because what goes hand in hand with safety is trust. And one of the challenges of this work has been, you know, particularly in the world of cancel culture, that's been one of the reasons why, you know, this anti-woke movement has really begun is because of cancel culture, in my opinion, humble opinion, is that we kick people out. You know, when they make mistakes, we kick them out of our hearts and we cancel them.
We're so afraid.
Yeah. And as a result, they want to fight back. And if they're people with privilege and power, they can. They can really screw some things up, right? But ultimately, inside that human is a fearful human, right? So all the anti-woke, anti-DEI backlash is rooted in fear. And it's spreading, and fear is infectious. It spreads faster than love and compassion. And with that said, that's our work, right?
Yeah. So tell me about the new book. What can people expect, and what will they find? And is it a book that allows them to use some of these practices? Tell me about it.
Yes, there are over 130 PRISM practices in there. I wanted this book to be basically, if it's the only book I write in my lifetime, this is it. I've put everything I could possibly put in there, but not not an encyclopedia, but just enough for people to be able to have training wheels and then go out in the world and break bias within their lives and outside. And the book is really about what bias is, a learned habit that can be unlearned, and the tools that can help them unlearn it, which is the PRISM toolkit. And I go really deep into every kind, basically it's for any identity anywhere in the world. So if you're Tatar in Russia, or if you're, you know, Tutsi in Rwanda, or, you know, you're Black in Brazil, you can apply the frameworks I've created. But I do focus on two identities very deeply, which is race and gender, and really talking about how these identities have come out in our world and how they work, how racial bias and gender bias works neurologically, and how it impacts our decisions, and how we can unlearn it. And again, from a perspective of compassion and deep time. So I actually, sometimes I'm like starting one of my chapters on diversity and identity. I really talk about 10,000 years of human history, right? Since we became settled societies. So folks can see themselves in it and we can see the roots of bias across the world. And my goal really is, it's really a prayer, most of all, that we apply these tools of kindness and empathy and really institute them in our lives and begin with ourselves. So all the biases we hold toward ourselves first, so we can unleash our own potential in our lives. And then, of course, as we shine our light, we enable others to shine theirs.
And it's very interesting because you have a foreword in the book from the Dalai Lama. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so I'm still, mesmerized by that question myself. I'll say three things, right? First is deep prayer. So I met His Holiness in 2011, 14 months after I had, um, that eventful night when I almost took my life. And then 14 years later, he's written this forward for me. But since that day when I met him, like, he's been in my daily prayers and my daily meditations. And I am someone who's someone of deep faith. So that's really important to me. And then the Dalai Lama, he read the book, and he's been one of the biggest proponents of science around contemplative science in the world. He's one of the founders of the Mind and Life Institute, where I'm a fellow. And he saw that the research that I provided in the book is really rooted in science. And for him, I say ancient Buddhist wisdom, but I use ancient Buddhist wisdom versus Christian or Hindu, which is in there. But ancient Buddhist wisdom has shown to work through current scientific technology like MRIs. So as a result, we can actually demonstrate through observation how it works.
Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah. So there's a research around mindfulness, right? So it really started in the 1970s, 1980s, and really showing that when someone practices 10 to 15 minutes of meditation every day, they're really able to manage anxiety. They're really able to manage depression, binge eating, other addictive behaviors. And so they were showing these, like John Kabat-Zinn and others, Richie Davidson, these are all scholars who've been studying this for several decades. But then as technology advanced, they started doing brain scans of people who were practicing these tools of compassion, of generosity, of care. Then they saw that their gray matter is different. So their ability to be more introspective, to move from system 1 to system 2 thinking, as Daniel Kahneman would say. So that's where we're like, oh, these tools really work. So you don't have to be a Buddhist or a Christian or a Hindu, but that's what our ancestors were doing: contemplation, prayer.
Yes.
I think about my ancestors who fought the brutality of the British in India, the British Raj. British colonialism was a racist enterprise, and it was horrifically violent. And I know my ancestors directly, opposed that using nonviolent resistance. And they inspired our civil rights ancestors here, the anti-apartheid movement, because it was rooted in understanding and knowing their bodies and being able to regulate their bodies. And that's what we now need, not just at a social movement level against a government, but also in our day-to-day lives. There's an anecdote that she reminded me of Thich Nhat Hanh. So he's also a national peace activist. And when he was in Vietnam, he once was encountering an American soldier with a gun who thought he was the Khmer Rouge. But in that moment, he had to de-escalate the situation.
Yes.
Otherwise, he would have been shot.
Yeah. And there are a number of programs where police officers are learning meditation and finding much more ability to de-escalate rather than escalate. And we know that that's a huge, huge problem. And so, yes, we have lots of proof that this works. And the nonviolence thing is something I wanted to ask you about as well. I know that the principles of nonviolence are important to you, and I wonder about how it's influenced how you do your work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think non-harming is a big principle for all of our work. And it's really rooted in kind of the mission of our work as DEIB professionals, because what we want to do is really advance equity and inclusion and healing of people. So for me, it's really about using words really carefully and cautiously, being really mindful of how these words would be understood by people in different settings, right? So really kind of understanding the context in where people are, making sure that there's a shared reality. And if not, then really taking moments to define words that may have a charge to them. So it lands in people's nervous systems in a way that they can accept it and don't go into that fight flight mode. So it's really important. And for me, this work is really about building the next social movement. right? It's which I believe is going to be business led in this century, because for the mere fact that businesses as corporate individuals have more power than individuals like you and I. It's out of necessity and circumstance. But with that said, businesses are made up of people, so it is a social movement in that way.
I wondered about the people who may be listening who are saying, yeah, this is all great, but I don't think it works. I don't, and also, or I'm way too tired. And why do I have to watch what I'm saying? They need to figure out what to say to me. I'm the one that's being injured. I'm, from a particular group. I've been from an oppressed group. I'm whatever. Why do I have to do this work? What do you say to folks who feel this?
Do what you need to do to take care of yourself in this moment. But my hope and prayer for you is one day you will be ready for this work, because we have to move out of this victim mentality, because that is harming us, because it's taking us away from our agency. And this could take, days, years, months. That's the journey I was on, literally. And I talk about it in my book, just what victimhood meant to me. It was an identity that I was attached to because of all of my other identities. But the second I was like, I'm not anybody's victim, I'm going to stop comparing myself to others, I really took my power and my agency, right? And it's felt so great to like live in my body in the fullness of what it is, knowing who I am versus what other people project onto me. And when I think about the people that inspire me, Ella Baker, Dr. Kane, Paul Robeson, Gandhi, Ambedkar, there's so many people, Grace Lee Boggs, they were people like that. You, Vernā, right? They knew who they are. Y'all know who you are. And but this invitation is no longer reserved for the cream of the crop, spiritual monastic leader.
Oh, yeah.
The invitation is for all of us. And I want to say, if you're hurting, I hear you. Get help. There's so many. In the book, I provide a whole section on communities and practices as resources that folks can reach out to. But, we have to start with ourselves, because, we have to become our biggest allies and our friends.
That's where the power really lies, right within us.
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned you're South Asian and you mentioned that you're gay, and you certainly have had all the yuck that goes with being in a society that doesn't always appreciate those identities. What would you say the strengths are that you derived from those identities and backgrounds?
It's such a beautiful question, and thank you for asking it, because I love that positive framing of it. And once I started my breaking bias journey and really undertook deep study of yoga and of meditation, and really began to learn about the 6,000-year tradition, right, that I come from, and really begin to take pride and connection with the earth. And I was like, oh wow, like all these stereotypes I've been fed are just that. They're just ideas. They're not real. They're not true. And I was able to use stereotype replacement in my own mind to uplift, my own family members. I also look down upon my family members, my parents who brought me here, for having an accent, for not speaking like an American, or whatever that means, right? But I had to let go of and release these stereotypes and really love them for who they are. And it's just nourished my relationships. And similarly for queer people, I think, more and more historical excavations are being done. I have a whole chapter on gender. And when I talk about gender, I talk not just about sex, but also gender identity and sexuality, because they're all connected. The roles that are imposed on a human body because of its anatomy, the expectations that are placed upon a human body in terms of who they want to love or not love. And in that research, I just discovered so many, diversities of genders and sexual orientations that have existed in societies globally, particularly in indigenous and animist cultures, that continue to exist now, but certainly existed as recent as like 100 years ago, until policies were superimposed on them as religious offenses, right? So for me, I'm like, wow, like there was so much resilience and creativity and love.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
bring those stories forward. Every time those stereotypes come up and I'm not good enough, I have one of those ancestors visit me and like,
You know what? And it's one of the things too, the term of Sankofa, which is to look back and breathe forward, right? I mean, to be rooted is such an incredible strength. But it's interesting, like more modern society is, you're an individual and you're by yourself, or maybe you've got 5 people like who you're connected to, right? And instead of really reminding us that we're collective, we're human beings, and as such, we're collectivists, and we also have ancestors, and we didn't just start today, like on our birthday. Like there's a whole series of things that happened that caused us to exist. And I think that it also goes to all that mindset of like scarcity, etc. But like if you think of yourself as, as an individual, then it's just you, and a few other people. But if you think of yourself as this larger, like this person within a larger tapestry of human evolution, right? And really see that we're moving. I keep saying to people, do not despair. We are on a movement as human beings, and we're getting better. We're not perfect, and we will never probably be, but we are evolving. Would you like to join?
Amen. I'm there.
Literally, yes. And I also just know that one of the things that stereotypes do. I mean, there've been some great things that happen as a result of us really recognizing our identities, but then there's all this kind of pigeonholing. And I know this so much as a Black person, people are like, well, you're Black, so this. And I know this is happening also in the Asian community.
Yes.
And I really wanted you to have a chance, and especially because this is the month, the month that we pay attention specifically on Asian heritage. Like, what are your reflections in this month, just about Asian heritage, and what do you want people to know or to be thoughtful about when it comes to being inclusive around AAPI, and also around breaking the bias for one of the groups that you are part of?
Yeah, and I think I have 3 things that have come to mind. First is really, an invitation to educate yourself. Like Asia, Pacific Islanders, such a diverse group of people. So just learn more about each of these really important and wonderful cultures, but not just about the cultures we come from, but our contribution to American history, because we've been part of the fabric since the very beginning. And it's really important to understand and acknowledge that, but also the unique struggles that we've had, from Chinese exclusion to Japanese internment to, Asiatic barred zones to, recent violence, the anti-AAPI violence that's surfaced across the country. That's one. Second is really kind of visit some of the sites, Asian American sites, regardless of the city you're in. Outside of restaurants, there are likely temples, there are likely churches, there are likely museums, there are likely art galleries, and really kind of have a felt sense experience outside of just the cognitive experience of reading or watching. And it's very different. It's very unique. And go in there with curiosity, with individuation, like noticing your stereotypes and ideas already, but literally going in and being like, hey, like, I am here because I'm curious. Would you want to tell me a little bit more? And you'll notice, you'll make new friends. And the third thing is really, share with family members and friends what you're learning, right? And also when you notice stereotypes being said about API people, really, again, with compassion and kindness, really standing up to them and really being like, what do you mean? Are you saying that all 1.3 billion Chinese people are this way because the one person you met was this way? Right. So like really finding unique ways to beginning to break those biases and inviting more people to do the same.
Such a good set of things to think about. I guess this may be my last question, although I could have you here forever. So I'm not going to promise. There may prompt one other question, but you do. We were talking about community and being connected and not being alone. You do a lot of work with your sister, and I would just love to know more about her and how that has all come to be. And
yeah, so I started my company with her support. So she was with me for 2 years. So the first 2 years of the company, she was like freshly out of MIT and was just like wanting to do more social services and social impact work. And she's like an operations guru. So she really helped support me in building out the PRISM toolkit and really thinking about frameworks as ways to teach people. And then she was able to apply a lot of the skills we were learning together in terms of the tech build out into. She went on and got herself another master's degree in artificial intelligence, and now she's an AI software engineer doing amazing things in the world, but also as a woman of color, as one of the very few women of color in that space, she continues to be like an advocate for DEI. So yeah, and of course, she's an informal advisor to me as I really think about the implications of some of the work in workplaces. Yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah, she's definitely a close friend and, of course, sister as well.
That's always wonderful when you can have family together, right? Talking about like just, it doesn't always happen this way, but it can be just such a really important way when, to have support, especially when you're building something new.
Yeah.
And you're not quite sure, like, is this gonna work or is this not gonna work? And like having someone who you can trust, at the beginning is I know just a real gift. And I usually leave my guests with things to do, and you did give us a couple of things about really bridging the gap and breaking the biases when it comes to Asian Americans, but anything else that you would like to tell our listeners what they can do, whether they're like in a leadership position or whether they're, no matter what kind of organization they're in or wherever they live in the world, what would you like to leave them with as a charge, as they're now just going to be turning off the podcast. Oh, that was lovely. But what would you like to point their attention to as far as behavioral change and action?
I think the first thing I would say is there's several things, but the most important thing is really taking an inventory of the places where they still have to love themselves, where there are gaps there, because the work of breaking bias really begins within. And the ways, you put yourself down, the way you think you're imperfect, you're inadequate, nothing to do, nothing to change, but really beginning with mindfulness there. So that's really my one very simple invitation. And if there are lists and lists, that's okay. Let's begin to write them down and become mindful of them. And then my hope is that you'll pre-order the book. It comes out in September. It's called Breaking Bias. You can learn more about it on anuguptany.com and really work with what you learn with the book. But there are also a host of other mindfulness-based tools out there that you'll equip, as well as therapy, somatic experiencing. There's so many tools, body and brain, yoga, that you can engage. And then when it comes to the work of DEI, I think it's really important right now that we double down on it. For me, this moment is reminiscent, as a historian, as someone who studies history, is reminiscent of what happened 100 years ago, right before the Asian Americans were banned from entering the country because of the Asiatic barred zones, where lynchings across the country were pretty much illegal. NAACP was being suppressed 100 years ago, and 200 years ago was the abolitionism movement. So for us, for me as a human rights activist and advocate, if there's fear, let's talk about it. Invite Vernā, invite me, invite others. Let's talk about it. Let's talk these fears through, but don't hold back. Don't take a step back. We really need you as leaders to really show up for this time, because we can really get there. We can really create workplaces and communities where we all belong, but it really takes your leadership to help us get there.
Thank you for saying that, Anu, because I feel like we've made some progress. This is not the time to turn around. Yes, we probably got to the tougher part now, because now we're talking about equity and we're talking about, really digging down at the root causes, as you said.
Yeah.
But that's going to deliver us into a much better place.
Yes.
We just need to have the courage and the community and the compassion and the curiosity that we need to pull this through. And so thank you for everything you're doing. I am so grateful to be now part of your circle, and I truly, truly appreciate you.
Thank you so much. And I so appreciate you. And I'm so grateful that we've been building a beloved community and our communities are merging now.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to follow me at Vernā Myers on Instagram and Twitter. You can also listen to my podcast on Spotify and Apple Music. Subscribe to my channel and share this episode with someone who is going to join us in this space. Make sure to visit my website, for DEI resources and online learning courses at vernamyers.com, and make sure you sign up for my newsletter to stay in touch with me. Thank you again for listening, and see you next time for more Sundays with Vernā.